It's mad, isn't it? It's 9:30. Where is it all? Three participants are obviously all there. Oh.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone at home. Good morning, everyone here. Not like it. Okay, everyone got a daf sheet. I'm just going to share screen at home. Good morning. Okay. So obviously this week's Parsha, so I'm just going to do a collective, my weekly mute. Excuse me, 1 second. Please unmute with questions as always. So this week's Parsha, obviously Vayakel. It's actually a challenging one for anyone giving a shiur or a Parsha, Parsha Divrei Torah, because not only do we have the Mishkan again, but we have Mishkan repeated, but we've got Vayakel and Pekudei separately this year, which does sort of lead to some challenges, because obviously in some sense Vayakel and Pekudei are rather dry parshas in the sense of, well, sort of repetition of the construction of the Mishkan, and sort of this week is very much repeating the instructions, and then next week is actually sort of repeating again the actual construction itself as opposed to the instruction of the construction. But nonetheless, there are some great gems, as always, in Ramban in this week's Parsha, which, albeit perhaps on the whole, the Parsha seems to be very repetitive. I think there are some particularly nice messages that we can read from the Ramban on the way throughout this Parsha. I'm just going to share screen for those watching at home, and then we shall begin. Okay, share screen. Okay, so this week's Parsha begins. Vayakel Moshe et kol adat bnei Yisrael. So and Moshe assembled l'hakil, I suppose, is to assemble all of kol adat bnei Yisrael. Vayomer lehem, and he said to them, Eile hadvarim, these are the things asher tzivah Hashem la'asot otam, which Hashem has commanded to perform them. And it begins with actually Hilchot Shabbat, which we won't delve into, but nonetheless, Sheshet Yamim te'aseh malacha, 6 days the malacha, the work shall be performed. V'yom hashvi'i yeh lechem v'yom kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton Hashem, and on the 7th day shall be to you a holy day, a Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbaths to Hashem. Kol ha'seva malacha yumot, and anyone who performs malacha on it will be put to death. Lo tuvaru esh b'chol mosh beitechem yom ha'Shabbat. You should not create fire or pass fire in all your dwelling places on the Shabbat day. So it's interesting if we look at this is not directly related to Ramban, but you sort of have a chiastic structure over these parashiot. You have Mishkan in Truma to Tzaveh, and then you have, so it goes Mishkan, then you have Shabbat, beginning of Parsha Kitisa, and then you have the Egel HaZahav, the Chet of the Egel, then you have Shabbat mentioned again, then you have the Mishkan again, which is Vayakel and Pekudei. So it's interesting, not necessarily our topic for now, but it's something which always fascinates me, the idea of this chiastic structure, that you have the fact that the Torah has specifically put the Egel HaZahav in between Shabbat and the Mishkan. I think it's part of the idea of saying how we are supposed to, how to, okay, sure, no pressure. Yeah, but it's always a question of how, what the message is that when we find something like this in the Torah, what is it the Torah is trying to tell me? And not directly related, but I'll mention it anyway because I like it, which is that I think it's to do with, again, it's the idea of showing you that the failing of Avodat Hashem, which is obviously epitomized by the Egel HaZahav in the middle, the serving of the golden calf, And if you want to achieve sanctity, so there's what we call Kedushat Zman and Kedushat HaMakom. I've spoken about it a few times. And that's really the idea that Shabbat is the sanctity of time, Kedushat HaMakom, Kedushat HaZman, whereas the Mishkan is Kedushat HaMakom, the sanctity of a place, a sanctity of space. You know, if you want to create a continuum of Avodat Hashem, so you need sanctity of time and sanctity of space to create this continuum, which is Avodat Hashem. That's why obviously the juxtaposition of Shabbat and the Mishkan is where we learn, well, what is it you're not allowed to do on Shabbat? We learn it from the Lamatet Malachot, the 39 Malachot that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. That's what we learn from the Mishkan. When we want to rest from constructive work, we look at the ultimate constructive work, and that is the building of the Mishkan, building a house for Hashem. Dafka on Shabbat, we say, I don't want to do that. So different modes of Avodat Hashem. So I thought I'd mention that anyway, albeit not Ramban, so forgive me for that. But nonetheless, so we're at the other end here now, coming away from Met and Shabbat, and now we go into the Mishkan again. So Pasuk Daled, Vayomer Moshe el kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Lemar, and Moshe said to all of the congregation of Israel as follows: Zeh hadavar asher tzivah Hashem. Lemar, this is what Hashem has commanded as follows: Kachume etchem truma Hashem. Take for you again this truma, this donation, this portion for Hashem. Kol nediv livo leviyah. Anyone who's generous of heart shall bring it. Eight trumat Hashem, the offering of Hashem. Zahav chesed and choshet, gold, silver, and copper. Now, multiple times we've had here this idea of adat b'nei Israel. And not just adat, but kol adat b'nei Israel. This time around, Moshe is not just telling daber b'nei Israel to the children of Israel, but kol adat b'nei Israel, the entire congregation of the children of Israel. And Ramban picks up on this phraseology. So if we look at the first Ramban there says, Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Israel, and Moshe assembled all the congregation of children of Israel. Yichlol kol adat b'nei Israel. So the Torah includes the entire, it generalizes the entire congregation. Hanashim, both men and women, the entire congregation. Ki kulam hitnadvu b'melechet hamishkan. It's to emphasize the fact that they all volunteered for the effort of the Mishkan. V'hinei Moshe himself, achar shetzivah la'Aaron ha'nisiyim, after he instructed Aaron and the leaders, v'chol b'nei Israel, and all the children of Israel, Hanashim, the people, Kol Asher Diber Hashem Oto B'Har Sinai, everything that God had told him at Mount Sinai, Achrei Shibur Haluchot, after the breaking of the Luchot. So Ramban's giving us sort of an order of what events, what's happening. So what's happened is, don't forget, chronological order according to the Ramban is that the Mishkan was instructed before Chet HaEgel, before the sin of the golden calf, but Moshe never actually got a chance to tell it over to the people. So we've had Moshe's received instruction. He comes down the mountain. The golden calf takes place. Achrei shibur haluchot, after breaking the luchot, Moshe's v'natan al panav hamsveh, right? Put the mask on his face, very topical. Chazar v'tziva. Now that he's dealt with the golden calf issue, now he goes back, explains Ramban, v'tziva, and commands them, instructs them, hikilu elav kol ha'ida, and assembles the entire nation to him, anashim v'nashim, the entire people. In other words, the reason for the repetition here for Ramban is because this is the first time Moshe is actually giving over the command of the Mishkan to the people. Until now, it's only been told to him, and then he had to deal with the golden calf issue. It could be, this is actually the morrow of his coming down from the mountain. In other words, this happened immediately after Chet HaEgel. He says, okay, we've dealt with it, come down from the mountain, now we've got to move on. But Amar leKulam, he says to all of them, Inyan HaMishkan, regarding the matter of the Mishkan, that he was commanded originally, Kodem Shibur Haluchot, again, because Ramban's emphasizing the chronological order here is the order of the Psukim. He's now going back, unlike Rashi, and he's saying that he's now going back to where he left off originally, which is the command for the Mishkan before he broke the Luchot. Ki kivan shenitrat selahem. Yes.
I always had this question. What happened to the golden calf?
We have to look at last week's Parsha. It got ground down. It got ground down and fed to, and in some sense, Chazal spoke about the idea of it being almost like an analogous to the mei sotah, to the sota water, the idea that, grinding it down and trying to see who was innocent or not. But he says, Ki kivan shenitrat selahem kadosh baruch hu. Since God was appeased finally after the sin, v'natan lo haluchot shniot, and then he received the second luchot, v'charat imo brit chadasha. That's what I quoted on Shabbat, anyone who was in the tent, right? This idea of Brit Chadasha, I didn't make it up, it sounds a bit Christian. This new covenant, but Ramban uses those words. Sheyelech Hashem b'kirban, a new covenant that Hashem will now go with them again, despite the fact that they've sinned. Hinei, therefore, chazru lekadmutam, they go back to their original status, u'la'ahavat klulotam. That's a beautiful analogy there. Ahavat klulotam, literally the love of their state of being a bride. Klulot is like bridal. It's also a pasuk in Nach, right? I remember the love of your youth, right? The love of your being a new bride. The way that you, Am Yisrael, followed me into the desert, Eretz Lo Zruah, in an unplanted and unfertile land. And that's the analogy Ramban is bringing here. That they go back to that original love between Am Yisrael and Hashem prior to the sin. And it's known, it's a new chance, it's a clean slate, it's a new covenant, and it's known that God's Shekhinah, God will manifest himself again among them once more, as he originally had instructed. As you said originally at the very beginning in Truma, they shall make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. In other words, why is it that he can now finally and properly and perhaps securely repeat and confidently repeat the commandment here? It's because now he knows Hashem has truly forgiven them. They're reverting back to the original relationship where Hashem will, in some sense, yes, that's what Ramban is saying here. Now we know the end of Kititha, it talks about there was a malach instead of the original, there's a slight downgrading, so to speak. But the fact that Moshe recommands the building of the Mishkan here is telling us that Moshe is confident that still the Shekhinah, they can get back to that. So that's why now, post Egel HaZahav, once the second luchot has been given, and so to speak, everything has been forgiven, Moshe can now instruct for the first time to Am Yisrael the building of the Mishkan, whose whole purpose is V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, as we learned a few weeks ago. They shall make for me a sanctuary so that I will dwell among them. Once God has forgiven them and returns back, there's a Brit Chadashah, a new covenant, and Am Yisrael can truly return back to them. Therefore, now Moshe says, I can feel confident to have them construct the Mishkan. And therefore, says Ramban, Siva otam Moshe commanded them, ata now, everything that he was commanded at the outset, prior to the Chet HaEgel. And that's what's happening here. Am Yisrael are forgiven. There's a chance for that ahavat klulotam, the love of their youth or the love of their newlywed love, right? And that could once be returned to now that everything has been forgiven.
There's always a shadow of the Egel.
There's always a shadow. Chazal themselves talk about this, that every punishment, so to speak, is a little, exactly, a certain percentage of it is to do with the Egel. The Egel is always the archetype of sin. And the imagery Chazal use, again, it's about this wedding. They talk about kala mazana tachat chupata, a bride committing adultery under her wedding canopy. The idea being that it is like the ultimate betrayal. That's why it's the ultimate sin. Although we saw last week, Ramban doesn't think it's idolatry in the classic sense, but much rather they were looking for a medium rather than they were looking for God. But the Chazal certainly are very critical about this. But Ramban here is returning to that imagery of the new bride and saying, let's have a fresh slate. So that's regarding the opening. Kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Hashem wants to forge this relationship again, and therefore that's why Moshe calls the entire congregation together. They're all privy to the receiving the instruction of the Mishkan now that we're forging the relationship anew. And that's why it's Kol adat b'nei Yisrael, says Ramban. What about the dedication to the Mishkan? Because not only did they all assemble to hear the instruction, but they all rose to the challenge, all of them. It's not just in terms of hearing, but also in terms of nishma, but it's also in terms of naaseh, if you like, and they all rise to the challenge. If we look at the psukim in the next section, dedication to the Mishkan. Vayavo kol ish, and every person came, Ashena sa'ol libo, whose heart raised him, it means his heart lifted him, meaning anyone whose heart moved him. V'chol asher nadava rucho, anyone whose spirit, nadava rucho oto, anyone whose spirit moved him or made him feel generous. Nadivut is generosity. They brought the offering of Hashem for the work of the temple, the tent of meeting, for all its work, and for the holy garments. Interesting phrase. And the men came in addition to the women, which Ramban will pick up on in a moment. Kol nadiv lev, every generous person of heart. They brought bracelets and earrings with vad and rings, chumaz and other sorts of copper or silver made work, better metallic garments. Kol kli zahav, every form of golden vessel, v'chol ish, and every person, asher nif tumas zahav l'Hashem. Anyone who had a waving of gold to bring to Hashem. We'll also pick up on that word snufa, which actually means waving. Yes.
Does this not imply that there were people who didn't?
Suggesting that everybody who felt moved to do so did so. Doesn't that
You're saying the fact that the Torah had to tell us that every person whose heart moved him came. The problem is, it's interesting. Kaf Aleph might imply that way. When you look at Kaf Bet, you can almost imagine a stampede of people. Hanashim al Hanashim. So al here is meant to mean like alongside or in addition to. And we'll talk about in terms of that in a moment, primary and secondary. But you can also imagine a stampede of people like rushing up, balagan of people trying to rush up to try and give things. So Kaf Aleph might imply that, but Kaf Bet, I think, but also they said, right, anyone who comes, there's anyone whose heart moves him. Then once you look at the Sukkim, they seem to say anyone who had, if you look at Kaf Gimel, right, anyone who had with him turquoise sky blue wool, right, but argaman right, all these things, but orot elim, basically anyone who had material, heviu, they brought it. In other words, anyone who had it brought. It wasn't a question of anyone who decided to. The Psukim later on seem to say anyone who had it. Kol meirim trumat kesef. If we look at Kaftalit, anyone who was lifting up had a lifting of kesef, an offering of silver, when a choshet or copper heviu. Meaning anyone who had it brought. That's what the Psukim seem to emphasize. Clearly, they didn't give all the gold away. We know that the Midrash talks about the fact that there was this sort of discrepancy between what Aaron says to them, why don't go ask your wives for their earrings, but then if you look at it, and the Chazal say he was trying to delay them because he knew the women would not give it up so easily. And but then if you look at the Psukim themselves, it says these mayhem, they took off their earrings, because I guess men at those times did have jewelry, and then they didn't wait. They just went with so I guess the women still had their, according to that midrash, but clearly not everything is given. Right. So we're gonna see in terms of Hanashim al Hanashim exactly which one is primary and which one's secondary, because Ramban picks on that. But there's a few details here in terms of the enthusiasm of the dedication to the Mishkan effort here. First, I want to pick up that phrase Asher Sa'oli Bo, who's anyone whose heart literally moved him, literally lifted him to donate. So Ramban picks up on that in the first Ramban there, Kaf Aleph. The term and the reason it says Asher Sa'oli Bo, anyone whose heart raised him, moved him, Lekarva El Malacha, to bring an offering for the work, or to bring that person close to the work effort. Ki lo haya behem shelamad et hamalachot ele mimulamed. What does it mean that their hearts moved them? Ramban explains, Ki lo haya behem shelamad melachot ele mimulamed. No one learnt these work. No one learnt this craft from a teacher, mimulamed, from someone who taught them. No one was an expert in building here or in forging or melting down gold or silver or whatever it was. None of them had learned this by craft. Oh, misha imen behem yadav klal. Anyone who's basically been taught by an uman, by an expert in the field at all. They were all novices. Aval yet matzah b'tiv'o sheyada lasot ken. Anyone whose heart moved him found b'tiv'o in his nature that he or she knew lasot ken, how to do the work. Meaning anyone who said I want to, volunteered and said I want to do this, matzah b'tiv'o, he found it in his nature sheyada lasot ken, that he was actually able to do it. Vayigbal libo b'darkei Hashem, and his heart became raised in the ways of Hashem. Lavo lifnei Moshe, to come before Moshe, lomar lo, to say to him, ani eseh kol asher adoni dover, I'll do whatever you need. Anything you say, I'll be doing. In other words, Ramban understands here this idea of Hashem sa'oli bo, anyone whose heart moved him, isn't just a comment about their motivation, that they wanted to do the malacha, but more than that, it's not just they wanted to do the malacha, they wanted to, but they actually found physically that people who were not trained presented themselves forward and said, you know what, I'm going to try, I'm going to have a go at, weaving. And they were able to do it. I'm going to have a go at, purifying, solding gold and silver, and they were able to do it. Again, this is part of the miraculous picture that Ramban has painted around the Hakamat HaMishkan, the construction of the Mishkan. We saw it last week, if we recall, when we spoke about Bezalel. The choosing of Bezalel, that he was miraculous in terms of his abilities. The fact that one man was able to be an expert in weaving and in gold and in silver and copper, when most people, even when they train, are only experts in one specific field. And if you have very fine hands for weaving, you're not typically naturally good at gold and silver and copper melting. And still here, Bezalel was good at all of it. And that's exactly what Ramban is sort of adding here, saying that anyone whose heart moved him, they basically said, they stepped up and they actually found they were able to do it. It was miraculous in nature. Those who volunteered and said, I'm going to try, found that they could actually do it themselves, even though they've never been officially trained. And that's what Ramban's picking up here. The nesiat lev, the moving of the heart, moved them. And it's actually like a really nice message in general, this idea of, God helps those who help themselves. But they had good intentions. And they said, I'm going to try. And Hashem saw to it that they were successful in their endeavors. And that's what Ramban's picking up on here. So that's in terms of their skill set. What about in terms of the people who came? So we saw in Pasuk Kafbet, Vayavo ha'anashim al hanashim. The men came in addition to the women. Al means on top or on, but it doesn't really make sense here. So it means they came in addition to. And Ramban picks up on this in the next paragraph there, Kafbet. For Tam, the reason it says Vayavo ha'anashim al hanashim, that the men came alongside or in addition to the women, this implies that the women were primary and the men sort of came in addition. And that's how Ramban understands it. But Avur says Ramban in order, or because Kihana Dava Batashchitin, since the tribute was, the donation was in jewelry, Himutsuya Etzel Hanashim Yoter, I think this is typically true today as well. It's more common that the women have jewelry, not men. V'chulan hayulahem, and they all had jewelry. Ufalkunis mehen v'tabotehem miyad, and the women immediately removed their rings, their earrings immediately to give it to them. Uvav tchila, and they came first, because primarily it was the women who donated the jewelry and the tachshitin, the jewelry. V'ha'anashim, and the men, ashenim tzu'ulahem, who had, heviu imahem, they also brought. Kitam al hanashim, the reason it says al hanashim, that the men came in addition to the women, shehein hayu sham barishona, the women were there first, v'anashim, whereas the men, the men were secondary to them. So Ramban points out the fact that the women were the ones who primarily gave the jewelry, A, because it was more common, and B, because they were more enthusiastic than the men. And that's emphasized by the Torah, specifically saying here something it doesn't typically say, that differentiates between the men and the women. Hanashim al hanashim. The women were the ones who primarily gave, and the men also did. And it's interesting, it might even allude to the midrash that Debbie mentioned, because that's really what happened, because the men in theory gave away their jewelry already, according to the midrash, most of them. So even those who did have, they weren't as many. So the women primarily the ones who gave the effort of the gold, and in this regard. But there's another interesting linguistic point that Ramban points out, again in a way that only Ramban knows how to, and that's regarding the difference between the gold and the silver and copper. If we go back to the previous psukim, when it comes to, scroll up again so people can see at home, when it comes to the gold in Pasuk Kaf Bet, if you look at the end of Pasuk Kaf Bet there, it says Vayavo hanashim hanashim, the men came in addition to the women, Kol divlev eviu, and it brings all the different types of things. Kol kli zahav, every gold vessel, v'chol ish, and every person, asher heinif tnufat zahav lashem, anyone who had a tnufa. Tnufa is literally a waving of gold. But if you look in Kaf Daled, when it comes to the kesef and the choshet, when it comes to the silver and copper, at the end of that paragraph in Kaf Daled, it doesn't say tnufat zahav, it says trumat. We look in Kaf Daled, it says kol meirim trumat kesef and choshet, anyone who lifted a lifting of kesef. So Ramban picks up on this subtle difference between tnufa and trumat, between waving and lifting. And why is it that the gold, it says tnufa, waving? Yes. Yeah.
I know, well, you're just going to say it, because one was for kesef and one was for zahav.
So zahav is called tnufa, whereas kesef and choshet, silver and copper, are called truma.
Called truma. That's
so the question, so Ramban picks up on this difference.
Okay,
so
sorry.
Let's see what he says. Just over to page 2. Why is there this difference? By the way, tnufa and truma, lifting and waving, are both moves that were done typically with the korbanot. You have the truma and the tnufa, they're different moves in terms of when people bring a korban, and especially with the lechem in the Mishkan, and eventually in the Mikdash, the way that the Kohen would wave with the person. One second, I'm just going to mute here. Okay. So let's look at the top of the page there. Top of page 2. Every person who waved a waving of gold. Says Ramban on this, what's the subtle difference? Lo hayu rabim, they weren't many. There weren't as many people who brought gold as those who brought the silver and the copper. There weren't as many people, and there wasn't as much gold as there was kesef and choshet, as much as there was silver and copper. There was less gold. We can assume why, right? Now, given the previous parsha. Al Kain, therefore, tikra zot nufa v'zot truma. In order to indicate the fact there was less gold than silver and copper, the Torah differentiates between the two and calls one snufa, a waving, the other one truma, lifting. Why? Why the difference? Says Ramban. Ki hemevi zahav, because the one who would bring gold, which was less common, there was less of it. Yenofef yado, like snufa, would wave his hand. The chashivut hanadava, literally would wave. Look what I brought. I brought gold out of excitement because it was rarer. Or halukuchim, or alternatively, those who actually brought it. Lokchim, those who received it, meaning the people working, overseeing the work, Yanifu has the harotol. They'd say, look, we got more gold. Like they would wave it to show everyone. The shevach hamayevi al nidvato, for the praise of the person who's actually bringing all the shabeach. We read it. The idea is being to the praise or for the praise of the person who's actually bringing the gold. Gold was rarer, so deal as opposed to truma. Truma, look what I brought, where they would lift it. Where it came to gold, look, we've got more gold because gold was rarer. Even we know because the golden calf, and also because of its expense. And therefore, so it's a subtle difference. Ramban says there's a whole story behind it. Again, the tnufa, the excitement of having gold to put towards the Mishkan effort, as opposed to the other things which are more common, is just the subtle difference of tnufa versus truma. That's regarding what everyone brought. How was it received? So we know that they came in their masses, and there was so much that they had to tell them to stop bringing at a certain point. We look in the Psukim, Moshe et kol trumas. They took from before Moshe the entire offering, Asher heviu b'nei Yisrael, which b'nei Yisrael have brought, limlechet avodat hakodesh, for the work of the service of the sanctuary, lasot ota, to make it. Behem heviu elav od nedava b'boker b'boker. Every morning they're bringing another tribute again and again. Pasuk Daled, vayavo kol hachachamim ha'osim et kol melechet hakodesh, and all the wise people, the clever people who were basically the experts who were performing all the work, each person according to the work that they're doing. Vayamru el Moshe, and what did the craftsmen say to Moshe? They said to him, Lema, as follows: Marbim ha'am lehavi, the people are bringing so much, midei ha'avodah lamlacha, more than the amount necessary for the work. Asher tzivah Hashem lasot. They're bringing too much. We don't need this much. So what happened? They tell Moshe, stop. We've got more than enough material. By Tzav Moshe, so Moshe commanded and ordered by Yaviru Kol B'Machaneh. They put out a voice in the announcement over the tannoy in the camp. Lemar saying, Ish v'isha al ya'asu od molacha trumat hakodesh. Stop bringing. No one do any more work for us. By Yikalei ha'am mehavi. What a beautiful pasuk. The people were withheld, right? Lehikaleh is modern Hebrew is to be imprisoned, right? They were withheld. They were held back from bringing. They were told it's too much. Like everyone's so enthusiastic, but now we've hit our quota. We don't need it. So Ramban discusses this. Yes.
Seems to be so repetitive.
So it's saying, so it's Pasuk Daled pointing out, so all the wise people who were doing Kol Melechet Kodesh, basically everyone, each person was an expert in their field. Each person who was in charge of the field that they were doing. I think we might be able to understand it. To the point, I think Ramban might help us understand it. So we'll. It's always good. It's always good to have questions raised, and then when Ramban answers them, then I'm off the hook. So, okay, all right. Let's see if Ramban answers that for us. It's an interesting question. So let's see the Ramban here. So they took from before Moshe. Hine, behold, b'yom echad, in one day, they brought all the entire tribute to the tent of meeting. What does it mean, the Ohel Moed? It wasn't built yet, by the way. So says Ramban, Shehu Shel Moshe, means the tent of Moshe, because the tent of meeting wasn't yet built. That's what they're trying to build. And on that very same day, the wise people, meaning the experts, took all the materials from Moshe's tent. And the following day, also early in the morning, and similarly, also the second day, also Moshe woke up the next day, and people had brought more the second day as well. El Oholo, to his tent, Nedava, further tribute. And Moshe ordered them to bring it to the craftsmen, to the experts. To basically every day more people would bring to his tent, and then he would give it to them. They would come and take it, or he would have it delivered. Until they eventually said to him, Shem Marbim Lahavi, they brought enough. It's more than enough material. So they were overly enthusiastic. Why does the Torah have to mention that the craftsmen, the chachamim, had to tell them to stop. Maybe we can answer also why Pasuk Daled seems to be a bit unnecessary as well. So Ramban says there the following: his Kir HaKatuv, the Torah mentions specifically Marbim Ha'am Lehavi, that they said that people are bringing too much. There are two reasons Ramban mentions. Number one is L'shabech et ha'am, to praise the people, Hamavi'im benidvatam, who are bringing so much out, volunteering to bring out there, out voluntary, means they're volunteering to bring, and therefore it's for shevach for them. It's a praise for the people that they were so enthusiastic to bring. That's reason number one. But reason number two, ulufa'er hachachamim b'nei manutam, and also to glorify the experts in their faithfulness and in their good faith, because what could they have done? They could have taken more, and they said no, we've got enough. But Gam HaNagid Alehem, also the person who's overseeing them, Meshubach Bezeh, is also praised for this. She'evir kol b'machaneh leman'am, that he sent forth a voice, an announcement in the camp to prevent them from bringing. Ki en lo chafetz b'kaspam, because he had no desire for their money, for their silver, v'zahavam, and their gold, k'sh'ar hamoshlim ba'amam, like other rulers over their peoples. Kinyan she'amar, as it says elsewhere, this is when Moshe is talking against Korach, lo chamarachan mehem nasati, I didn't take a single donkey from them. Moshe says against Korach and his whole congregation, I never took anything which wasn't owed unto me. I didn't take a single donkey from you. What's Ramban saying here? When people pay an abundance of tax and everyone pays their taxes, sometimes there's money left over, right? And a ruler, well, if they're ruthless, they can put it to, for personal use. It can disappear from the books, or they could put it to something else and say, okay, we'll keep it and put it in a fund and we'll use it for something else. These rulers didn't do that, says Ramban. They said, we've been commanded, we've been instructed to build a Mishkan. The minute the materials have reached the amount we have, the quota, we're not going to ask for any more. We're not going to take it as a spare and just sort of hoard things in the, under the leadership. The minute we've brought the right amount, it's enough. And it's to their shevach, in addition to the shevach of Am Yisrael, who brought and volunteered so much and were so enthusiastic, it's also to the shevach, to the credit of the workers and the wise people who were the ones who were really overseeing. And they said, no, we don't need it. We're not taking a penny more. We're not keeping some fund, doesn't belong to the clergy or to the, to the crown, that we're keeping these funds. No, like we've brought what we've done and that's it. And it's to their shevach, says Ramban. Maybe that might explain why Pasuk Daled now, if we go back, emphasizes all the wise people came, those who were performing all the holy work, each person from his work that he was doing. In other words, they're the ones who know what's going on. They know how much silver and gold they really need. They know, and still they're the ones who come forward and say, we don't need any more. Each person in their own domain, in their own jurisdiction was honest and said, okay, we've got enough. Now we don't need a penny more. We don't need an earring more. And therefore, it's to their credit that they said they took exactly what they needed and they said, we don't need any more. We don't need to hoard for the Mishkan purposes at all. Not for personal gain, of course, nor for, as an extra kickback, and neither for just to hoard for, the state. And that's to their credit.
The half shekel is purely for color, not.
Right, the half shekel, right? Parsha Shekalim this week also is right. The shekel, well, yes. I mean, typically that's what it became. Half shekel there was more of a count, but that was it. Seemingly being in Parsha Ki Tisa is not. It's not clear if that's the typical one, although that is the laning that we do use. Historically, the shtat was for the korbanot of tzibur, of the communal offerings. But this is exactly we were instructed to build the Mishkan. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to hoard a penny more from Israel, and that's to their credit. Obviously, I alluded to the fact that we all know that the effort is repeated again and again. And I'm still happy that we can find many insights into the Parshiot. The question is why? Why does the Torah have to tell us again and again? Why couldn't it have just said, and they built the Mishkan Ka'asher Tzivah Hashem et Moshe, we can move on to Vayikra. Why? So Ramban does in a half comment here, which is nonetheless a very important one. He does allude to it. So I want to look at what Ramban says inside in the next repetition with the Mishkan. So the Torah tells us, once again, all the wise of heart with the performing of the work, they made the Mishkan, The Mishkan here refers to the covering over one of the coverings over the Mishkan. So they made it into 10 panels with the various materials. So we're going into repetition again now. So Ramban says the following. If we look there in Chet, Ramban says, after the Torah has completed going through the general and also the specifics, the maaseh, of the actual performance of the malacha, it then generalizes again once more the bringing of all materials to Moshe. And says, it goes and they bring the Mishkan to Moshe, et ha'ol, that kol kelav, the tent, and all its vessels, etc. Why does it do this? In order to show their wisdom that they brought everything to Moshe in order. No one brought their work before Moshe until everything was finished. In other words, all the Chachamim kept everything away in their homes, whatever it was, until everyone had finished. And then only in order, when they were ready for it, did they bring everything to Moshe. No one turned up with, the shulchan and said, here it is, and Moshe had nowhere to put it. They waited till everyone was done. So Ramban is saying there was an importance to the order here. Ka'asher Amar, just as it says, Vatachal kol avodat Mishkan ol moed. First it says, and the entire work of the Mishkan, of the tent of meeting, was finished. And only afterwards did they start bringing everything. Va'achareishin nishlema, only after the work was completed, ne'esfu kulam, did they all gather together, v'heruota elav keseder, and they showed it all to Moshe in order. Amru tchila, they said at the beginning, Rabbeinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, hinei ha'ohel v'hinei kelav, here's the oil, here's its utensils, and here's its all its various pieces. Va'achreichen, and only afterwards, hinei ha'aron v'hinei badav, here's the aron, here's the staffs, v'chein ha'kol, and so too with everything. So Ramban firstly picks up on a specific point, and he says that there's credit here to show that they did everything in an orderly manner. I suppose that might be miraculous in itself. That they were, the work effort was done in an orderly manner, in an orderly fashion. They all brought the everything in order. They waited for everything to be completed, then they brought everything before Moshe. And it's the idea that everything was done in order. That's a specific reason. But now Ramban gives a more fundamental and general reason. V'ala klal, he says. Let's read what he says. This is his general understanding. In general, v'ala klal, meaning over everything in general. Kol zeh derech chiba, derech mala. This is all a way of chiba, affection, derech mala, and a way of mala, right? Importance, significance. Lomar, that is to say, ki chafetz Hashem b'malacha, that Hashem desires the work, umazkir ota b'torato pa'amim rabot, and mentions it in his Torah many times. Why? Laharbot sachar le'oskim ba, in order to increase the reward for us. We're sitting here learning in it now. Ki'inyan, just like Masha Midrash Yafeh, just like they say in a beautiful Midrash, we'll quote that in a minute, but we'll see the analogy. What does Ramban say? He says, the reason for the repetition of the Mishkan again and again is Ki chafetz Hashem b'malacha. Hashem likes it. It's important to Hashem, the avodat HaMishkan, that we're dealing with building his house. And therefore, he mentions in his Torah many times, that's Ramban's terminology, to increase schar, reward to those who deal with it. It's a desired and beloved part of the Torah, and therefore Hashem repeats it multiple times. And then he alludes to the Midrash, just as they say in the beautiful Midrash, the following, Chazal say, Sichat avdei avot lifnei kadosh baruch hu mitoram. Oh, sorry, but Midrash, Yafeh. Yafeh is the first word of the Midrash, excuse me. It should be Yafa, the Sikha is feminine. Yafa Sichat Avdei Avot Lifnei Kadosh Baruch Hu. The talks or the conversations of the servants of the forefathers are more beautiful before Hashem, mitoratam shel banim, than the Torah of the children. We'll talk about that in a moment, and we'll explain it. Shaharei, because Parshato shel Eliezer, Shnaim Shlosha Dapim, because the Parsha of Eliezer is 2 or 3 pages long. What's that Midrash? That Midrash is regarding Parsha Chai Sarah. Why is it that it tells us the story that Abraham sends his Eved, who Chazal identifies as Eliezer, he sent his Eved to his slave to his homeland to find a wife for his son Yitzchak, And it says the whole story there of the long story about how he meets Rivka at the well, and he makes a stipulation that if she asks, offers water to him and his camels, then she's the one. And then it repeats the story. And then when Eliezer, Eved Avraham, is brought to Rivka's house, to Betuel, the story is, he repeats the whole story again. It doesn't say, and he told them the story. It repeats the entire story again. Chai Sarah is full of the story of Eved Avraham, of the servant of Avraham. And Chazal asked that, why is it the Torah, elaborates on the story, repeats the whole story again? It's just, he could have just said, and everything that Eliezer, said, he told to Betuel. He doesn't. It repeats the whole story again. It makes Chai Sarah longer. When, in the meantime, Hilchot Shabbat, how do we learn Hilchot Shabbat? We learn Hilchot Shabbat by a juxtaposition of the Mishkan to the law of Shabbat. That's how we learn all Hilchot Shabbat. Why is it elaborating and talking in a seemingly arduous manner to go over all the story of Eliezer when it comes to something fundamental like Shabbat? We learn from the smallest thing, and the Torah could have elaborated a bit more. So the Torah says, the Midrash says rather, Yafas Sichat Avdei Avot, the conversation that the Eved of the forefathers has is more beautiful before Hashem mitoratam shel banim than the Torah of the children. Meaning, at the end of the day, Hashem has a certain, use the correct word here, interest or preference, so to speak, in the avot than in the banim, and therefore it was more important because in terms of Hashem's investment, so to speak, in the Torah, that he elaborates on what was more, even if it means that certain halachot are truncated and spoke about much less than the story of the servants of the forefathers, due to the love that Hashem had for the forefathers. Why is Ramban bringing that here? He's saying that in some sense, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a preference as to what his Torah contains. So to speak, it almost sounds a little bit heretical, but a personal preference to what his Torah contains. And this Parsha is, so to speak, important to Hashem. And we can understand why the Mishkan is important to Hashem. It's about the Asuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. It's we are osek, we are dealing with building the Mikdash or the Mishkan, v'shachanti b'tocham, and then in return, HaKadosh Baruch Hu dwells in that Mishkan but not b'tocha, but b'tocham, right, among us. And that's the idea. We don't have a Mishkan, we don't have a Mikdash. When we are osek, we deal with these parashas week after week now in our Monday morning share on Zoom, in person, preferably in person. But whatever happens, we are fulfilling that idea of the Asuli Mikdash. Let's make for Hashem a Mikdash, the Shachanti b'tocham, and I will dwell among them. Our isuk, our dealing with these parashas is desirous to Hashem. And those beautiful words again of Ramban. Lomar, to say in the first line of the final paragraph, Ki chafetz Hashem b'melacha. Hashem desires the melacha. And therefore Hashem chooses to mention it in his Torah many times, to increase reward for those who are busy themselves with it. We are being busy, says Ramban, with a parsha which is Shachafetz Hashem, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires, and that's why he repeats it more and more. It's a similar midrash as well. Chazal say anyone who learns the korbanot, the parashas of korbanot, it's as if we've offered a korban before Hashem. So that's why the idea of preference of learning maybe Sefer Vayikra in some sense, even though it's full of technical detail of the korbanot, Chazal say it's a kid. Hashem looks at it as if we ourselves have either been seen to have rebuilt the Mikdash. And the same thing I think is true here, that our effort in these parashas is desirous before Hashem, and that's what Ramban is getting at here. So moving on from there then, I think we can look at another element of our investment in Hashem's Mikdash and Mishkan. And that we spoke last week about the kior, the basin with which the Kohanim would wash their hands, and we spoke about two. Ramban had mentioned at least two reasons: the simple and then al derech ha'emet, the more mystical reason. Reason number one, it was simply cleanliness, that you don't touch the food of the king, meaning the korbanot, before you clean your hands. And then a more mystical reason, the idea of tahara, the idea of purification, we spoke about last week. For those who could hear me on Zoom at least, I was a little bit hoarse then. The idea of purification. There's two reasons for the kior. But now we're actually going to look at the materials made of the kior, and Ramban's going to quote Rashi in quite a well-known midrash. So let's see what the pasuk says. The mirrors of the kior. Vayasit hakior. So he made the kior, the basin, the choshet of copper, the etz kanon of choshet, and its base was also made of copper. The marot hatsovaot, with the mirrors of also bimarot. So what with the mirrors of the women who, it's not clear what sover means here. The women who are many or gathered together, we'll talk about it. Asher tzava'u, who gathered. Petach ohel moed, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So what we do see is that the kiar was made by the mirrors of women. That we do know. So Rashi quotes the following midrash, and Ramban's going to expand upon it. But Marot Tzavot says Ramban there in Chet, but not Yisrael, and this is quoting Rashi word for word more or less, but not Yisrael hayu biyadan marot. The women of Israel had in their hands mirrors, sheraot behen, which they would look into, kshehen mitkashtot, when they were beautifying themselves, getting ready. V'af otan lo ikvu, and even though they were personal handheld mirrors, af otan lo ikvu, even these personal effects, they did not withheld from donating. V'haya Moshe mo'es behen, and initially when Moshe saw people bring their private mirrors, Moshe originally rejected them, mitpnei, because she'asuyin li'et Sahara, they're designed for the Eight Sahara. They're designed in order just to deal with physical beauty. They're not designed for any other blessed purpose. And therefore, Moshe originally was mo'es behen. He despised them. He wanted to reject them. Amar la Kadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said to Moshe, Elu chavivin min hakol. These personal handheld mirrors are more desirous to me than everything else that they've brought, says Hashem. She'al yidehem, because through these mirrors, he'emidu hanashim tzvaot rabot mitzrayim. These mirrors, due to them, this is why the women were able to establish many great, numerous numbers. Sava is an army or hosts, many great numbers for Mitzrayim in Egypt. In other words, what's he talking about? That when the men who worked very hard, the women would make sure that there had still be continuity to Am Yisrael. And the Midrash says that the women would use these mirrors to beautify themselves so that when their husbands came home from the terrible slave labor, nonetheless, the men would still find their wives attractive, and then they would go on to have children still, despite the terrible conditions of Mitzrayim. So that's the Midrash there is clearly picking up on the word B'marot Sovaot, the women who were army leaders, right? Sover, they made armies, meaning they ensured that through their actions that there was continuity to Am Yisrael despite the terrible conditions of Egypt. Sover to color with an iron, like Tseva. But Sover here, Tzava is an army in Hebrew. Tzava is an army. It's also Hashem Tzvaot, Lord of hosts. That means multitudes. So they did. It's not clear to what extent but I'm sure the women also did work. One midrash says that they made the women do men's work and the men do women's work. But the idea is that women were the ones who were according to the midrash. The women were the ones who said, even so, we are going to ensure continuity to Am Yisrael. And they kept Am Yisrael going, and it's to their shevach, to their credit, to their praise. And therefore, the third line there, v'na'aseh kiar mehem, and that's why the kiar was made, where they washed their hands from these mirrors. Shehu l'shum shalom ben ish v'ishto. It's very fitting, says Rashi, quoting the midrash, that that's why dafka the kiar is used for these mirrors, because these mirrors were for shalom bayis, peace between the husband and wife. And what do we take from the water of the kiar? Lahashkot min hamayim shebo. We take from the water in the kiar leisha shekina la ba'alav v'nistara. Regarding a sota woman, when there's a question about infidelity, they take the water that the sota woman drinks, they take it from the kiar. In other words, that the mirrors which make the kiar, which were mirrors for shalom bayit, is also used in some sense for shalom bayit for the future. Lashon Rashi, that's a quote from Rashi until now. That this was the uniqueness of the mirrors that the women donated, and Moshe originally wanted to reject them, and Hashem said no. Elu chavivin min hakol. They're the most desirous out of everything else that's brought, because they're not just for the Eight Sahara, but they're not just there for physical beauty. They were there in order to ensure continuity to Israel. So Ramban expands upon this midrash now. Hatam, the next paragraph. V'hatam b'midrash hazeh. The reason for this midrash is shebachol melechet hamishkan kiblu ta'tachshiktim min hanashim. Why is this so special? Because surely throughout all of the malacha of all the mishkan, they accepted, we spoke about this earlier today, they accepted jewelry from the women. As it says, as we saw earlier, that the men came in addition to the women. And all these various parts, bracelets and earrings and rings and all other types of jewelry. So why is it mentioned here? Aval, but what was special about this? The fact that they should make a kli especially out of this jewelry or this mirror, It was made exclusively from the mirrors. Moshe would not have chosen to do such a thing. To make a kli, ironically, also, what's the idea of the kiyah? That you're supposed to be purifying yourself from going outside the Mishkan to coming in. Dafka, to make a kli which is wholly made out of mirrors, which were used in this sense, Moshe would never have chosen to do such a thing until Hashem told him explicitly. So that's Rashi. But Ramban has an issue with this. He says, "V'lo yadati," but I don't know how Rashi would explain, according to this explanation, how would he explain the words in the Psukim where it says, Asher tzav'u petach ohel moed. If you go back to the pasuk, it says, Asher tzav'u, the women who hoarded or were amassed, petach ohel moed, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Because according to the Midrash, when is it that they would sover, that they increased in number? It was in Mitzrayim. It wasn't now. It was earlier when they were already in Mitzrayim. So the psukim, the wording is a bit difficult, says Ramban. Maybe it means to say, maybe it means that they brought it, that they brought in their masses to the tent of Moshe, shekaru ohel moed, which is called the ohel moed, because there was no ohel moed yet. Ohel moed, the meeting place, where's the tent of meeting? It means Moshe's tent, prior to any Mishkan. And he accepted it by the word of Hashem, because the Mishkan itself was, the tent of the Mishkan was not yet made. So he says he has a little issue perhaps with the language, although he tries to deal with it. Now he goes on to Unkelus. The Unkelus Tirgem, Unkelus translates it into Aramaic. Da'atiyan litzala'a litra mashkan zimna. Da'atiyan is Aramaic for which they brought, or they came, litzala'a. Litzala'a is to daven. Titgabel tzelotahon, may out filot. Salot is to receive. So that they came to litzla'a means in Aramaic to daven or to serve. Litra mashkan zimna, the entrance of the tent meeting. So Unkelus understands that, what does it mean? The women brought it to daven petach ohel moed. So how does Unkelus understand? Says Ramban, notim dvarav l'divrei Rabbeinu Avraham. So he understands like Ibn Ezra, She'amar, who explained, Shahayu hanashim ha'ele ovdot Hashem. They were coming to serve Hashem. They came with mirrors to serve Hashem. V'saru mita'avat zeh ha'olam, and turned away from the ta'ava, from the desires of this world. And they gave their mirrors away as a tribute. In other words, they were saying, we are now of Dot Hashem, we're giving away our mirrors. We don't care about physicality anymore. So Ibn Ezra, and Ramban is suggesting Unkelus as well, perhaps understood, this was actually not like the opposite of the Midrash. They're giving up giving up their ways. They're giving away their mirrors. Well, we don't want that physical anymore. We want Sala'a, as Unkelus translates it. We want to serve Hashem. They come every day to the tent of Moshe Hitpalel to daven v'lishma divrei ha-mitzvot, and to hear about the mitzvot. So Ibn Ezra and perhaps Unkelus as well understand it a bit differently, almost the opposite. They weren't giving up the mirrors, saying we're leaving that way. They weren't donating them, saying this is something holy, but rather giving away the mirrors and saying we leave that life behind. So it's a different explanation that we might not typically be used to. But Ramban gives another explanation in the final paragraph there. He says, "V'yitachen od," but it might mean further. Shne'amar b'derech hapshat, that in the simple way of reading the pasuk, it means she'asa hakiyar v'kando, that he made the basin and its base, mimarot hanashim, from the mirrors of the women, asher ba'u mehen sava gadol, from whom came a great mass, a great army, meaning great nation. V'ne'esvu el petach ohel moed, and they gathered at the tent, letet marotehen benidvat liban, to give their mirrors out of the voluntariness of their hearts, meaning out of total volunteering. No one will force them into it, just out of goodwill. That's how he understands. He understands the pasuk to mean, if you read the pasuk, Vayatakir on a choshet, he made it out of copper, that kano on its base, the choshet b'marot etzavot asher tzavu, which all the women who had many children in number, petach ohel moed, that they gave it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. In other words, it's not the Petach ohel moed, and if you actually look at the Tamim, the notes, the trop, this works better. The Petach ohel moed is a separate piece. They came, all the women who had amassed many children, they came and brought their mirrors to the tent. That's how, out of benidvat liban, as Ramban says, out of goodwill, from the will of their heart. V'haya nechoshet hamarot nechoshet kalal. It was a shiny copper, memorat, polished, v'yafeh me'od, and very beautiful. They were nice, right? For a mirror to work, for copper to function as a mirror, it has to be very polished, otherwise there'll be no good reflection. and therefore, therefore Moshe designated the mirrors for this kli, because they were the shiniest thing around, right? In order to function as a mirror properly, they had to be shiny, and therefore Moshe deliberately set them aside initially for this vessel. V'hanashim birotan ken. Once the women saw this, that they basically that their mirrors were being put in a particularly nice kli, ne'esvot, they would gather together, uvaot, tzvaot. They would come in their masses. Tzava meaning masses or numbers. They came tzvaot. They came in their numbers, right? In their myriads. Letet kulam me'arotehen, that they would all donate their mirrors. Le'asot behem kol ha'kiyar v'chano, that through their mirrors the entire kiyar and its base should be made. In other words, once they saw that it wasn't just being melted down or whatever and put in a bar, but it was actually being used to make the kiyar specifically and exclusively from their material. The women all turned out and they said, we want our mirrors to be part of this kiyar. V'gam nachonhu, and it's also correct, says Ramban, she'itkavnu b'kach mitchila mipnei inyan ha'sota. And it's also true that initially they did have the intention also because of the matter of the sota. What we mentioned earlier, that the sota water is taken from the kiyar, and therefore the mirrors which represent shalom bayis, they wanted that to be what made the kiyar where the water is taken from in order to help further shalom bayis for when there's an argument down the line about infidelity. V'hen kiblu ken alehem b'simcha, and they accepted upon themselves happily. V'hit nadavu, and they volunteered l'tet bo kol marotehem, and they volunteered to give for it all of their mirrors. In other words, Ramban in here is basically, he's not disputing what Rashi had said. He's just going along with the pshat line, and he accepts both things in parallel. There was a bigger picture here. There was also a technical picture. The women saw that while the mirrors were being used for a beautiful kli, and which was exclusively out mirrors because they needed something shiny, they all turned up and no one withheld anything, and they all gave for the effort of the Mishkan. And in parallel, he still accepts the penultimate line of Ramban, but Gam Nachon, it's also correct that they also had a better covenant, and that's typically what Ramban likes to do. As we've seen, he'll offer his pshat without necessarily rejecting the drash, which is on top of it, and can accept both, and they don't necessarily contradict one another. And that's basically what happens here. So we've seen today quite a lot, what seems to be perhaps a dry parsha. Ramban has filled a lot of insights for us. We spoke about at the beginning the idea of a Brit Chadashah, the idea that now Moshe tells them to give over materials for the Mishkan specifically now, because once they're forgiven, we're going back to that initial love of a Shachanti B'tocham dwelling among them, and now is the time again to instruct Am Yisrael to build the Mishkan. We spoke about the dedication to the Mishkan. We spoke about the women's volunteering, the fact that the Nisiat Lev, the lifting of the heart, that even those who weren't skilled, once they tried, found that Hashem saw to it that they were able to be skilled, as Ramban understands it. We spoke about the abundance of people bringing, the generosity, and the honesty and integrity of the people in charge of the work, that they didn't take a penny more, not to keep for a future, not for themselves, but not for anything further. We spoke about the repetition of the Mishkan. We spoke, Ki chafetz Hashem b'malacha, Hashem desires the malacha, and that's why Ramban says the Torah repeats Mishkan again and again, because it's a desirous parsha. The idea of being osek and dealing with these parashiot for Ramban is incredibly special. And finally, we spoke about the nashim tzedkoniot, the righteous women who gave their mirrors, which Moshe initially thought was for a bad thing. Hashem says, no, dafka those I want for the kiyar, for being metaher, for purifying the hands of the kohanim. So we'll add things there. Have a wonderful week. Okay.
Thank you.
Shiva. Okay.